Hello Stormtroopers and welcome to this special in-between episode. Season 8 has ended and Season 9 of Eat the Storms, your favourite poetry podcast, coming to you on platforms like Spotify, Apple, Google, Breaker, Podbean, Player FM, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Castbox, Podcast Addicts, iTunes, Apple Music and YouTube will return in September. But in the meantime, we're taking a little look back at Season 8 and its Behind the Storms chats. After a successful 7 seasons featuring over 750 international guests on the podcast, I decided it was time to shake things up and do a little deep dive, inviting one guest to chat with me on every episode. They proved to be so successful that I decided while we wait for Season 9 to kick off, we'll revisit those chats as mini standalone episodes. My first Behind the Storms companion was David Nash. He was in Chile at the time when we caught up, but of course he's originally from County Cork here in Ireland. We were talking not only about poetic beginnings, how he discovered writing, but we were also talking about No Man's Land, his debut full collection, which was published by Dedalus Press, shortlisted for the Pigott Prize from the Listowel Writers' Week, shortlisted for the Ondaatje Prize, and last month it won the prestigious Seamus Heaney Prize for Poetry. So why don't you settle back with a sip of something cheeky and a snack and have a listen to David and I chatting all things poetic, followed by David reading poems from his most extraordinary collection, No Man's Land, which you should all have in your bookshelves. My name is Damien B Donnelly. I get to be your host and producer for today's in-between episode with David Nash. This is Eat the Storms, going behind the storms. I hope you enjoy the show. David, thank you so much for joining me today. This is the first Eat the Storms mini interview. When I started, I originally thought all of these episodes, they're going to be pre-recorded. It will be just each guest sending me in the audio because they're all living in too many different countries and I'd never be able to keep in contact with all of those time zones. But it's Season 8. Therefore, Season 8 comes with the pressure of having to grow. And so I've decided that I'm going to interview at least one of the guests. And so thank you so much for joining us all the way from Chile, even though you are from Ireland. How long have you been there? What are you doing in Chile?
Thanks for having me, first of all. How long have I been here? I came here first about 7 years ago. And I come and go. So I'm not here the whole year round. It's about 6 months on, 6 months off, depending on the year. Sometimes I'm not here very often. Like last year, I wasn't here very often at all. Mm-hmm. And I won't be here for much longer either. I kind of moved here on a whim. I had been living in London for quite a long time and I was really sick of it and got offered a job here and came and then quit the job but stayed in the country.
And had you been to Chile before that at all?
No, I didn't really know anything about it either. I didn't speak Spanish at the time. It sort of fell in with a group of artists and have ended up working with them and with people they knew and with people they knew. And I can survive off that here. I could never survive off that in Ireland. So,
but you've maintained that sense of connection with Ireland. You still come back. It's not that you've left.
No, and in a way, I don't feel like I live here. When people say like, "Where do you live?" Where do you live? I kind of hesitate because I live in Ireland and I also live here. I suppose in the past sort of 4 years, mm-hmm. the connection with Ireland has been a lot stronger as well. Pandemic kind of was a catalyst to that. Yeah. Because I found myself in Ireland and I couldn't leave, even if I had wanted to. And that fed into the book. That sort of connection with Ireland in many ways kind of got a lot more profound the last like 3 or 4 years. So I feel not more Irish or anything like that, but I've sort of made an effort to connect with what that might mean.
And clearly, and congratulations, you mentioned the book there, so huge congratulations on No Man's Land, which came out in November last year, wasn't it, with Dedalus Press?
I remember.
I grabbed my copy at Books Upstairs yesterday, and I have literally already been earmarking my favourite poems. Half of the book is already earmarked just since yesterday, so huge congratulations. It follows on from Islands of Chile, from 14 poems, and then prior to that you had your children's Spanish book. But perhaps before we get into No Man's Land, the idea of doing these interviews is to go back kind of to the beginning and to talk about poets, to talk about what inspired them first of all. So you're now in Chile. You grew up in Ireland, down in Cork. But then I was wondering, I suppose, where along the road of growing up, where did this interest in poetry spring from? You can tell already from the collection that it definitely came from the landscape, but how did it first grab you?
I was having this exact conversation yesterday, actually, and I seem to remember always writing. There was something about the achievement of shaping a sentence well, be that in a joke or a turn of phrase that resonated or that landed well. From really early, I found that there was a kind of a pleasure in doing that. I wrote stuff down as a kid constantly, but I suppose I didn't really know that what I was doing was poetry until much later.
Were there influences from the family in terms of writing or expression or performance?
Not in an explicit way, but my family have creative minds, definitely.
Yeah.
And that sort of idea of being able to shape a sentence well definitely was an important thing growing up, like having the mot juste, something that has value in our family. And that definitely had an influence, and it definitely encouraged everyone in the family to kind of up their game constantly,
And did poetry then become, even though perhaps you hadn't named it as poetry, but the writing was that sort of cathartic in a way of sort of figuring out who you were, your position, your place?
No, and I don't look at poetry as being a catharsis either. If anything, it's an escape from emotion for me. There's a lot of people who are able to transfer or to work through their experience as it happens, contemporaneously. But I find that I need an awful lot of distance from the feeling in order to write it, the feeling, and it's never been any different for me. I have never looked at it as a way of like, I need to write something down right now to work out what's going on in my head or in my heart. No.
Do you think then distance to a degree helped in the formation perhaps of No Man's Land?
In the sense of distance from feeling, yeah. Physical distance, no, because the book itself has to do with my immediate surroundings in rural West Cork. It was sort of a reaction to what was physically in front of me, but a lot of the sort of emotion that goes into those poems and my inner life, almost all of those poems were written at a remove of 6-7 months.
And do you remember when you first called yourself a poet, called yourself a writer? Do you remember the first sort of time sharing? Was that embarrassing, exciting when other people read your work?
I worked, like I kept working at poetry, and it's a craft, like you get better the more you do it. And I remember going up to my parents' attic at some point when I was about 20 or 21, and I wrote something and I thought, that's a poem. I've been writing poems in inverted commas for an awful long time, and I wrote this thing down and I thought like, oh shit, I think I've actually done the thing that I've been trying to do for so long. So that's when I called myself a poet in my own head, but saying it out loud to a person is a different kettle of fish. And I suppose that sort of fell into place once I did my master's in London, actually, because other people started calling me one, and I thought, oh shit, that might actually be true,
It does sometimes. It takes other people to put the hat on us, before we realise sometimes we're slow to accept what we really are or what we've evolved into. And I remember being in Amsterdam once, and I'd been a very shy child, and when I was 25, 26, I still thought I was a shy child. And I went out with somebody for a drink and I said to them, I'm very shy. I've only been here a few weeks. I'm very shy. And she looked at me and said, what? You're the most chatty, confident, upbeat person that we've ever met. Everyone knows you. You've only been here a few weeks. But I hadn't realized because for so long I'd been, no, Damien is a shy person. But someone else had to say, no, wake up. But yeah, it was an interesting realization.
That makes complete sense to me as well. In the poetic sense, it took other people to name me,
Yeah.
For it to have any sort of meaning, which is not a great reflection of my sort of personal fortitude or anything, but at the same time, that's how it works a lot of the time.
And are you happy to claim it? Are you happy to be a poet? Is this what you thought was going to happen?
I suppose in some ways, this is the direction my life has been taking without me driving the car explicitly. I'm really happy to claim it.
Talking about now No Man's Land, your debut full collection, which was published, as I said, by Dedalus Press in November 2023. I've only read almost half of it now. It's set predominantly in the landscape of your hometown, as you said yourself. But it does spread itself out, through the rivers, through the birds, the soil, this extraordinary playfulness that you have with language, the mixing of Irish, of English, of myth, of mountain. Sometimes I felt almost to ease us into this steep sense of loss that is still planted within it. Even those moments of planting tree seeds in the soil, it almost seems to be asking too much of hope, too much of ecology itself. Perhaps you yourself can tell us a little bit more about the collection, how it came to be, what it was like putting it together.
I found myself in the landscape that I had grown up in and that had shaped me in many ways. About 3 or 4 years ago at this point, for the first time in a really long time, and because of...
And this is COVID, so you're locked down there.
Yeah, so because of that, I had nothing else to do except for walking, and the more I walked, the more I explored, the more curious I got about what I was walking inside. Which was nature, really. Then I started to think about nature, and am I part of it or am I outside of it? And I began to get very curious about the names of things, because I didn't know if someone put a tree in front of me, I wouldn't have known what name it had. So I thought, okay, there's a little project, and I don't know if everyone has the same experience, but once you start down that road, it's very difficult to not see things and want to explore what they are and how they grow and things like that. That fed into curiosity about folklore and land knowledge and the sort of folkloric information that exists and still exists, actually, about landscape and flora and fauna and all of these things. And then I started to relearn Irish, which I had sort of left by the wayside a little once I had moved out of Ireland. And relearning Irish kind of put a different sort of colour on all of these things that I was discovering. And by direct consequence of engaging with the natural world, it became a book about loss as well, as a mirror of my own feelings, because it's in a dangerous state, and what I would have looked at before as being an idyllic landscape, I now see as something that's not very healthy at all, and the book deals with that too.
And was that to a degree a part of childish innocence? You see the pretty tree, you don't see what's affecting it, and you came back then as adults aware of ecology, climate.
There's an amount of naivety in it, yeah, and there's an amount to which I think the propaganda had worked on me. Propaganda being the Tourism Ireland, like Fáilte Ireland stuff, where what we're looking at as idyllic agricultural greenery is dead, really. That is land not fulfilling its potential in any sense. a lot of people, including me, would have looked at that and thought, how beautiful, how lush and full of life, and it's quite the opposite.
Yeah. Was that a harsh reality?
Yes, it was. It was, and continues to be, actually, because there's, I don't know. I'm quite a pessimist anyway. Anyway, so it's difficult to convince me that there's much hope around the corner. And it was a relatively bleak personal time as well. But I have to say that it's been said to me that my work is sort of romantic and anti-romantic at the same time, in the sort of philosophical sense, like there's always this nagging kind of kernel of hope won't go away in the depths,
And there's a humor, there are humorous touches in there, there's enough to keep us afloat and to keep us almost wishing.
It's ridiculous and it's absurd, really, the situation we find ourselves in sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to laugh at it. Like, that might be the only response sometimes.
Yeah.
And humor is something that for a long time I would have balked at employing as a tool in poetry, because I thought that that's not what poetry was. But humor's hard to pull off. It's something that I think is a little bit of a Trojan horse. It sort of smuggles the truth past someone whilst they're unawares,
Like those plastic bags underneath the sinks that we laugh at the beginning, but it had such a twist that you think that you found your identity, this is what it means to be Irish, and then suddenly you start living in different countries and you say, every bag stored under their sink.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good example of it, I suppose, of the way that I like to employ humor, because it is a tool. It can mask a deeper, possibly darker truth.
One of the poems that you read earlier on this episode, the penultimate poem in the collection, was Queen. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more, just maybe explain to the listeners a little bit more about this sort of mourning ritual, about this sense of keening, this not so little grief?
I knew at some point in the collection that I was going to write about those customs and those traditions, and I did a ton of research about keening and the tradition of it in the past, and like, it didn't die out all that long ago, I suppose. And for the amount of research that I did to come out with a poem that's 11 lines long, it seems like I got a really bad return in my investment there. But I have a lot of knowledge about it.
There are 11 very beautiful, pessimistic lines. The beauty to it.
Well, I mean, there's no such thing as bad education, really, either. I've learned an awful lot, and I'm a store of information now about keening. But in the process of learning about it, I thought that it's quite I don't know, is it irony that the thing that I'm researching, which is a lamentation, is quite sad in itself, and the thing is dead now, and it would be interesting to treat the process of lamenting as a lament, so there's a sense in that poem of a little bit of a letting go, like, oh, I really loved this, and this was a really important, useful, powerful custom, and I really wish we had held on to you, but we didn't. So sorry, but goodbye.
It attaches up to the land itself. Is that an almost it's too late, we need to say goodbye?
Maybe not that pessimistic, but there is a reason why it's towards the end of the book. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the collection itself, in terms of putting it together, in terms of its layout, It's really interesting. It's quite fresh in terms of how you did it. And there's also a certain amount of humour in it. You know, you have one poem that's split across 2 pages, and you know, you start reading the first few lines and then you think, oh, hang on a minute, maybe I'm reading this wrong. And, you know, if you continue all the way down, you'll get to the end and you'll be rewarded with the nonsense. And then you have another poem that's, you know, that's vertical. How important was it for you? And I know that you were also a visual artist. How important was it to have the visuals be as connected to this theme?
Quite important, actually. And I'm gratified that you noticed. Each poem was treating, like it was treading very similar ground, literally as well as figuratively. So it was important to me that the way that they looked, first of all, on the page, the way that they interacted with the space of the page, and the way that they sort of presented themselves, the way that they fleshed themselves out, would appear differently as well. So in the sense that if there's, I don't know how many poems are actually in the collection, if there's 50, then it's like different points of view of the same thing, sort of, you know. And they sort of took on their own lives, and once one was finished, I felt that was that for that particular piece of work, and that I had to move on to something else, which is why I guess it took such a long time to write, because I was resetting myself poetically each time before moving on to another one, you know. The other thing about that, I wanted it to be surprising. The most important thing to me as a writer and as a reader as well is that I want poems to surprise me, and I want to be pulled out of expectation. When I read stuff, which is a tall order as a reader. It's a big ask, and as much as a writer too, because that sets a very high ambition. So the layout of the book, I suppose, was a way of achieving that, if I achieved it.
I think you definitely achieved it. Huge congratulations on it. Before we go, just perhaps we'll talk about the front cover. How did the front cover come about?
I did a residency in the Byrne College of Art in 2022, and it was the first time that a residency was given to a writer there, because it's a visual art college, really. So the people who are resident there, who are doing PhDs and masters, are involved in a really wide spectrum of art forms. And the people who come and do residencies also, and they interact very directly with the landscape and the materials that are available immediately. As it happened, there was a woman who was doing the residency at the same time as me, who was working a lot with fabric, making, dyeing her own fabric, and doing these really intricate and really beautiful embroidered paintings, I would kind of describe them as. Her name is Anna Galindo. She's from Canada, I think. And I saw some of her work in the open studios towards the end of our residency, and I just thought, I have to use this, because she had sort of encapsulated the way that rural Ireland looks, sort of wild, but at the same time very I don't know the word in English, sort of like squared off and fenced off at the same time.
Yeah, and it's extraordinary, because as I went through the collection, like it grows on you, and its relevance becomes much more prevalent as you go through it. Like every now and then I'd read a poem, and then I'd go back to the front cover and go, okay, I can see why it's pulled me in. I think it's a beautiful companion to the collection itself.
I'm really happy with it, and I'm proud of the cover.
And sorry, what's the artist's name? Let's just mention her.
Anna Galindo.
Do you have any more readings? I know you're in Chile at the moment, but are you coming back for any more readings?
Yeah, I will be. I'll be coming back in April, and I imagine that I'll be in Ireland or the UK for the rest of the year then, doing readings in festivals and stuff like that. I'm still sort of filling up that calendar. hopefully I'll get to see and meet a lot more people, and you in person at some point.
Yes. I look forward to actually shaking your hand and congratulating you. David, thank you so much for joining us today on Eat the Storms. It's been a real pleasure, and congratulations again on No Man's Land.
Thank you very much, Margaret.
And now we're going to hear David reading from his collection No Man's Land. This episode first aired on Saturday, the 3rd of February 2024. This is David Nash.
Just as a little bit of background, the book came out of my moving back to Ireland and my home in rural West Cork a few years ago after a long time away, and rediscovering the landscape and riverscape of my upbringing, and finding there was so much I didn't know, from folklore to land knowledge to the Irish language itself. And inevitably, I suppose, given the state of the environment, it became a book about loss and personal loss as a reflection of that. The first poem I'm going to read is called Elegy for an Eel in Advance. Elegy, because in this moment you have no inkling that you'll die, but you will die. Advance, since forward and forward are homophones in some dialects. Eel, according to the Oxford Dictionary of Etymology, comes from Proto-Germanic elas, which is of unknown origin. For, an, in, and a comma, because these, like some other squiggles I know, might seem immaterial in the grand scheme of things, but aren't. All coincidence begins and ends in the Lee being my nearest river, your mirror. But language isn't astrology, nor neatness kismet. You aren't bound for me. You're somewhere off Bermuda. You're an eyelash in the Gulf Stream, too far down even for torchlight. And what? Are you really so slick as to thread every eye and sneak past every trawler in the Atlantic? To get to where I am, behind a dam which is itself behind another dam, in circumferences of chance I give you a snowballs. Plus, you'd have to really want to, and I doubt you do. I understand that there is no such thing as a river too good to pass up. Rusalka, Selki, Sedna, Varun, Clownlir, Becca Hesten, Mulgwishin, Bunyip, Leviathan, Siren, Pinkoya, Poseidon, Noah, Styx. Whose ever mythology got water right, I wish you theirs. I spent a lot of time during my year in Chile, and I'm working on a book of translations of poets who are working in the indigenous Mapudungun language of southern Chile. And I found that, of course, while I was kind of scouting for participants for the kind of anthology, that an awful lot of their work has to do with nature loss too. What I'm going to read is not a translation, but it's a poem after a poem that I read in the process of my research by a poet called Lionel Lienlaf. Ill Wind. Across the stump fields, desperate, panting, the wind turns back on itself, a Labrador duped by the dummy throw. It unhinges then, can't fathom there's a world unholdable in its teeth, a bird's nest it can't bracket. A few summers ago, I guess, or last summer, a few summers ago, I was in the Burren doing a residency, and I came across the idea or the fact of turlocks for the first time. These are, if you don't know, lakes that appear and disappear depending on the level of the water table or however much it's rained. And one day this discovery, this fact, impeded my walk home. Turlock. Water with its moon in Libra, now you see it. Sudden water, where yesterday you'd happened on a desire path home, which would have halved the time it takes. Now with water doubled. Doubled water. The lake you see before you now is the lake you don't, inverted. The water table with its legs in the air. An underground, overed, a frown upside down. You roll your jeans up to ford or afford it, and exactly at waist height you are one of two things: an anchor tethering sky or the lake's space program. This water one day will leave land in its wake. You will stand in a grass meniscus while the water untroubled summer's enclosure. Now you don't. I realised while writing the book that a lot of the landmarks that seemed so mighty in memory were quite modest in reality upon rediscovery. And I thought about how that's how that's often the case with firsts. Your first river, your first mountain, your first love, even. I spent every summer of my childhood in the shadow of Slievemore in Achill Island, which seemed at the time insuperable, but I went back for the first time in about 20 years to see that it's a pretty humble thing, really. This poem is divided in three. The first third, I suppose, is Slievemore, the anglicisation of the name of the mountain. The second is On Slieve Moor, which is the Irish of it. And the third is The Big Mountain, which is the literal translation. Slievemore. Not just any mountain. In metres all told, not even that. Slievemore is cetacean in memory. It never soared, it surfaced. Every summer some mainlander would mistake weather for climate and scale it in a dry spell, unready for the heavy hand of mist that inevitably fell and swept them off it like whatever was left of the bread from the breakfast table. On Slieve Moor. I've ridden others. I'm not talking mountain range numbers of mountains, but mountains enough for comparison. Mountains with main character strut. Background mountains, greener mountains, browner. I've broken some mountains in, been broken back in by some mountains. I have palmed escarpments to tameness. I've drawn ridges up into themselves, given form sometimes to arêtes with just one look. I've clung to mountains that gave no purchase to the spur, dumb mountains, mountains covered in dust, mountains that buck on fault lines, and mountains, in the end, that were not worth mustering. The worst thing is to find that the first one, all this time, was enough. The Big Mountain. A field of bog cotton at the big mountain's foot nods in deference, in surrender, and in unison. A scattering of Catholics at sea. Not just any mountain. The. The last poem I'm going to read is called Cuine. The whole book, I suppose, is a kind of Cuine. But this poem is a Cuine for the Cuine itself, in a way, a tradition, a Cuine for a tradition that has faded into memory, if even that. Cuine. I'll whisht soon, I promise. But first, a little grief. Different though from the species of keening we know. For if I were to keen in print, I would rightly be cancelled a posteriori. By dint of being dead, or at least old, its will takes precedence over mine to resurrect it. So how do you lament then? To whom? For whose benefit? Soon I'll whisht, I promise. Soon. Thank you very much for listening. Gurmagif.
Poetic peeps and gentle persons, in-betweeners and non-conformers, genders all and genders equal. We've reached the end of this special in-between episode of Eat the Storms, the Poetry Podcast, revisiting Season's 8's Behind the Storms chants. Today's special episode featured musings, discussions, diggings, and the poetry of David Nash, whose collection No Man's Land is available to buy from Dedalus Press, and whose pamphlet The Islands of Chile is available to buy from 14 Poems. As always, full details in every episode are available over at Eat the Storms. Just click on the website, eatthestorms.com, click on the podcast section called Listen to the Podcast, and there you'll find a blog post for every episode. This was Behind the Storms with David Nash. I will be back with you next week with another in-between episode. In the meantime, just to remind you, the podcast may be on holiday, but I am far from on holiday because your host and producer has just opened submissions to issue 4 of The Storms, our printed journal of poetry, prose and visual arts. A huge thank you to Dublin, UNESCO City of Literature, for their support for this issue. And with that in mind, the theme for this issue is Dublin Days, from city to shore and across the sea. I am looking for your poems, your short stories, flash fictions, your non-fictions, your essays, your photographs, collages and your paintings and sketches of what Dublin means to you. Were you born and bred here? Are you now residing here in one of its suburbs that is ever increasing? Have you sailed from its shores and set down on other lands, but kept a part of it in your heart, in your soul, or gathering dust somewhere in a suitcase? Or has it just been a holiday destination, or is it on your bucket list? Dublin and its diaspora, yesterday, today, and all that will change tomorrow. We are open for submissions until the 4th of August. Until then, my name is Damien B Donnelly, and please, until next time, ensure that you all stay bloody poetic.